Late April 1814, and the Hartfield Spring Assembly glittered with the false promise of connection, its chandeliers casting golden light across a sea of silk and ambition, while Eleanor Ashworth stood near the eastern wall and counted the wilting hothouse flowers arranged in their porcelain vases, 14 arrangements slowly dying in the overheated room, much like her hopes for this season her aunt had insisted upon 3 weeks prior. The deep green silk of her gown, unfashionable in its simplicity, yet chosen because it flattered the complexion she had inherited from her mother, felt suddenly conspicuous among the pale muslins and delicate pastels worn by younger, slimmer women who moved through the assembly like swans gliding across still water. Eleanor was 28 years old, possessed of a fuller figure that society deemed excessive, and blessed with a tongue sharp enough to cut through the polite fictions that governed these gatherings, a combination that had rendered her, in the estimation of the marriage mart, thoroughly unmarriageable. She watched her Aunt Harriet across the room, deep in conversation with a cluster of matrons whose feathered headdresses bobbed with each exchange of gossip, and felt the familiar tug of guilt at the worry she knew lined her aunt's face each morning. Lady Harriet Greville had taken Eleanor in after her father's death, had managed her modest inheritance with care, had brought her to London for this final desperate attempt at securing a future that did not involve slow fading in a country cottage, and Eleanor loved her too much to simply refuse, though every fibre of her being longed to flee through the tall windows and disappear into the cool April evening beyond. The whispers reached her ears like persistent insects, impossible to ignore despite years of practice. Lady Beatrice Langdon, resplendent in rose pink and cruelty, stood not 10 feet away with her devoted audience of lesser gossips, her voice pitched at that particular volume designed to wound while maintaining deniability. Such a shame about the Ashworth girl, too much of everything and too little prospects. One might think she would have the decency to stay in the country rather than subject us all to the spectacle. Eleanor kept her expression carefully neutral, having learned long ago that any visible reaction only fed the appetite of those who feasted on the pain of others. She had made peace with her situation, or so she told herself during the quiet hours of the night when sleep would not come and honesty was unavoidable. She would not marry, would manage her small inheritance carefully, would find contentment in books and her aunt's companionship and the small pleasures available to a woman of limited means and unlimited social liability. The musicians struck up a country dance, and Eleanor watched the couples form their sets, watched the young ladies with their hopeful smiles, and the gentlemen with their appraising glances, and she turned away toward the refreshment table at the far end of the room, where at least she might find something sweet to occupy her mouth and prevent the sharp words that perpetually threatened to escape it. The refreshment table offered little refuge, but Eleanor claimed it nonetheless, selecting 2 small cakes from the silver tray with deliberate care, while the music swelled behind her and the dancers moved through their figures in patterns she had long ago stopped hoping to join. The cakes were delicate things, topped with sugared violets, and she ate the first one slowly, savoring the sweetness while pretending absolute absorption in the task. A woman entirely content with her own company and requiring nothing more from this evening than confectionery and the blessed absence of pitying glances. She had nearly convinced herself when the shadow fell across the white tablecloth, and she looked up to find Sir Thomas Ravenscroft standing far too close, his wine-stained cravat evidence of an evening already well lubricated, his smile carrying that particular quality of condescension that wealthy men of middling looks reserved for women they considered beneath them, yet somehow still worthy of pursuit. Sir Thomas was 45, a widower whose first wife had died in childbirth, along with the heir he desperately wanted, and he had fixed his attention on Eleanor with the determination of a man who saw her modest inheritance as adequate compensation for her physical shortcomings and her sharp tongue as a flaw that marriage would correct. "Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice carrying that false warmth she had learned to despise, "how delightful to find you here enjoying the refreshments rather than the dancing, though perhaps," and here his eyes travelled down her form with unconcealed assessment, "you should eat less and dance more if you wish to find a partner for the remainder of the season." Eleanor felt the familiar heat rise in her chest. the anger that she had spent years learning to swallow, to transform into something more acceptable, something that would not confirm every terrible thing society already believed about women who dared to take up space and speak their minds. But tonight, with Lady Beatrice's whispers still echoing in her ears and the wilting flowers marking time toward her own fading prospects, she found that the careful restraint she had cultivated simply would not hold. She met Sir Thomas's eyes directly, noting the surprise that flickered there at her refusal to look away in shame, and when she spoke, her voice was clear enough to carry to the small cluster of guests who had drifted toward the refreshments. "You should eat less," she repeated, as though tasting the words for their quality. What a novel suggestion from a gentleman whose own waistcoat buttons appear to be engaged in a desperate battle for survival. "But I have a counter-proposal, Sir Thomas. Perhaps you should talk less, and then we might both find the evening more agreeable." The silence that followed seemed to expand outward like ripples in still water, and Eleanor watched Sir Thomas's white mottle with colour, watched his mouth open and close without sound, and she became aware, with a sinking sensation that warred with fierce satisfaction, that a tall gentleman standing near the windows had turned at her words, and was watching the entire exchange with an expression she could not quite decipher from this distance. Sir Thomas retreated with what dignity he could muster, which was precious little given the suppressed laughter Eleanor could hear from somewhere behind her, and the deep crimson that had spread from his neck to his receding hairline. And she stood frozen at the refreshment table, with the second sugared cake still held in her fingers, the momentary triumph already curdling into something cold and heavy in her stomach, as the full weight of what she had done began to settle upon her shoulders. She had spoken her mind, had refused to accept insult meekly as a woman of her position was expected to do, and while some small, fierce part of her soul sang with satisfaction at the memory of Sir Thomas's gaping mouth and bulging eyes, the larger part understood with terrible clarity that she had just confirmed every whispered accusation Lady Beatrice and her ilk had ever levelled against her. The Ashworth girl, they would say, sharp-tongued and ungrateful, too proud for her situation, does she not realize that a man like Sir Thomas represents her best and perhaps only prospect? And who does she imagine will want her now that she has proven herself incapable of the most basic feminine grace of accepting criticism with a demure smile and downcast eyes? Eleanor set the cake down carefully. Her appetite entirely vanished, and became aware that the tall gentleman near the windows had not looked away, that he was studying her with an expression that contained neither the mockery she expected nor the disapproval she deserved, but something else entirely, something that looked almost like recognition, as though he had witnessed not a social catastrophe, but something far more interesting. She did not know him, could not place his angular features or his dark hair touched with early grey at the temples, or the quality of his evening clothes that spoke of wealth worn without ostentation, and she found herself unable to hold his gaze, turning instead toward the sound of Lady Beatrice's voice, rising with gleeful malice as the story spread through the assembly with the speed of fire through dry grass. "Did you hear what Miss Ashworth said to Sir Thomas?" The words reached her ears carried by 3 different voices within as many minutes. Such vulgarity, such impropriety. Her poor aunt must be mortified. Though really what can one expect from a woman who has clearly abandoned all hope of making a respectable match? Eleanor moved through the crowd toward Aunt Harriet, the sea of silk and superficial smiles parting before her with new wariness. And she watched her, Aunt's face transform from hopeful inquiry to gentle dismay as the story reached her ears ahead of Eleanor's arrival, the pearl earrings that had belonged to Eleanor's mother, catching the candlelight as Aunt Harriet shook her head slowly. "My dear," her aunt said softly, taking Eleanor's hand in her own, her touch warm despite the reproach in her eyes. "Must you always say exactly what you think?" And Eleanor had no answer that would satisfy either of them as the rain began to fall against the tall windows, and the evening stretched before her like a sentence she must serve until she could finally escape into the anonymous darkness beyond. The Pembroke garden party arrived 2 days after the assembly. Like a summons Eleanor could not refuse, for Clara had been her dearest friend since childhood, and had written with such warmth and insistence that to decline would have been both cowardly and cruel, and so Eleanor found herself standing at the edge of the manicured lawn in her lavender muslin, watching the assembled guests move through the spring sunshine like exotic birds while she remained rooted near the garden wall, acutely aware that whispers followed her like shadows, and that the story of her exchange with Sir Thomas had grown in the telling until she had apparently not merely insulted him, but had thrown a glass of wine in his face and called him names unsuitable for polite company. Clara found her within moments, her pregnancy visible now beneath the flowing lines of her mourning dress, her face bright with genuine pleasure, as she took Eleanor's hands and drew her forward into the garden with the determination of a woman who would brook no hiding. "You came," Clara said, "and I am so glad, for I have heard the most ridiculous stories, and I wanted you to know that I think Sir Thomas Ravenscroft is a pompous fool who deserved far worse than whatever you actually said to him, and besides, my husband's cousin witnessed the entire exchange and told me you were magnificent." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at this unexpected defense, at the mention of a witness she had not been able to identify, and she allowed Clara to lead her past the early roses toward a cluster of chairs where refreshments waited. The garden was beautiful in the late morning light, the roses not yet fully bloomed, but promising, the grass immaculate, the fountain at its center sending up a gentle spray that caught the sunlight and scattered it like diamonds. And Eleanor tried to focus on these pleasant details rather than on the sidelong glances she intercepted from other guests, or the way conversations seemed to pause and shift as she passed. Clara settled her in a chair with a cup of tea and a plate of sandwiches, chattering happily about her hopes for the baby and her plans for the nursery, and Eleanor listened with genuine interest, grateful for the normalcy of it, for the reminder that not everyone saw her as the sharp-tongued spinster who had finally revealed her true colors. It was during a lull in Clara's enthusiastic description of wallpaper choices that Eleanor became aware of being watched, and she turned her head to find the tall gentleman from the assembly standing some 20 feet away near the stone fountain, his dark eyes fixed upon her with that same expression of curious interest she had glimpsed through the crowd 2 nights before. "That is Lord Thornbury," Clara said, following Eleanor's gaze. "Frederick Sinclair, my husband's cousin. He arrived from the north last month and has been avoiding every eligible young lady his aunt has thrust at him. But he seems rather fascinated by you, which I find entirely understandable since you are by far the most interesting woman here." Eleanor watched Frederick Sinclair incline his head in acknowledgement when he realized she had noticed him, and she felt something shift in her chest, some small movement of hope she immediately tried to crush, for surely his interest could only be the curiosity one might feel toward any unusual specimen, and yet his gaze held neither mockery nor disdain, only a quiet attention that made her feel, for one brief and terrifying moment, genuinely seen. The afternoon had deepened toward evening when Frederick Sinclair crossed the lawn with purposeful strides, and Eleanor watched his approach with a mixture of fascination and dread, certain that whatever came next would be either a confirmation of her worst fears or something far more dangerous to the careful walls she had built around her heart over 28 years of learning that hope was a luxury she could not afford. He stopped before her with a slight bow, and Clara excused herself with a knowing smile that Eleanor would have found irritating had she not been so entirely focused on the man now standing close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and the ink stain on his right index finger that spoke of letters written, or perhaps something more creative, and she wondered what a viscount could possibly want with a woman whose chief accomplishments were a sharp tongue and an unfashionable figure. "Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice lower than she had expected, and carrying a warmth that seemed at odds with his reserved reputation. "I must confess, I have been attempting to find the courage to approach you since the assembly, for I witnessed your exchange with Sir Thomas and found myself more impressed than I have been by any conversation in London this entire season." Eleanor felt her cheeks flush and her defenses rise simultaneously, uncertain whether she was being mocked with unusual sophistication or complimented with unusual sincerity. And she heard herself respond with the tartness that had become her armor. "I was not aware that insulting tedious men was considered impressive in polite society, my lord, though I suppose it does provide entertainment value for those fortunate enough to overhear." Frederick's mouth curved into a smile that transformed his somewhat severe features into something approaching handsome, and he gestured toward the stone fountain where a bench offered seating away from the other guests. "Would you walk with me, Miss Ashworth? I find myself curious about a woman who reads Gothic novels but argues with the conviction of a philosopher, and I should very much like to know what books occupy your shelves when you are not being subjected to dull assemblies and duller suitors." She should have refused, should have remembered that men of his station did not seek out women like her for honorable purposes, should have protected herself from whatever game he was playing. But instead, she found herself rising and walking beside him toward the fountain, acutely aware of his height and his presence, and the way the clouds were beginning to gather overhead, as if the weather itself sensed something momentous in the making. He asked her about her reading, and actually listened to her answers, responded with opinions of his own that revealed a mind as hungry for ideas as her own, and when she mentioned her preference for natural philosophy over the romantic novels Clara favored, his eyes lit with genuine interest, and he spoke of experiments he had conducted at his northern estate, of questions about the natural world that kept him awake at night, and Eleanor felt something dangerous stirring in her chest as she realized that this man, this Viscount with his ink-stained fingers and his serious eyes, was speaking to her as though her thoughts mattered, as though she was worthy of real conversation rather than mere tolerance, and she did not know what to do with the terrifying possibility that his interest might actually be sincere. The first drops of rain fell upon them like a warning, and Frederick looked up at the darkening sky with an expression of mild annoyance, before turning to Eleanor with something that might have been reluctance in his eyes. "We should go inside," he said, "though I confess I find the company within far less appealing than the company here," and Eleanor felt her heart stutter at the implication, even as she told herself he was merely being polite, merely performing the courtesies expected of a gentleman toward any lady caught in inclement weather. He offered her his arm as the rain began in earnest, and she took it after only a moment of hesitation, acutely aware of the warmth of him through the fabric of his coat, and the way her lavender muslin was already beginning to darken with moisture as they hurried across the wet terrace toward the French doors, where other guests were crowding inside with exclamations of dismay and laughter. They had nearly reached the threshold when Lady Beatrice Langdon appeared before them like a pink silk apparition, her golden curls artfully arranged, and her smile sharp enough to cut glass as she looked from Frederick to Eleanor and back again with an expression of theatrical concern. "Lord Thornbury," she said, her voice carrying the particular sweetness that Eleanor had learned to recognize as poison, "I do hope Miss Ashworth has not been monopolizing your attention, for there are so many young ladies here who have been simply desperate for your conversation, and I should hate for you to miss the opportunity to become better acquainted with more suitable company." Eleanor felt her cheeks burn and her hand begin to slip from Frederick's arm, the old familiar shame rising in her throat like bile, but before she could retreat into herself, Frederick's arm tightened against her hand, holding her in place, and his voice when he spoke was colder than the rain now soaking through Lady Beatrice's pink silk and spattering mud upon her pristine hem. "I find myself quite content with my present company, Lady Beatrice," he said, "and I require no assistance in determining which conversations are worth my time, though I thank you for your concern, misplaced as it may be." Lady Beatrice's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered, her eyes narrowing as she stepped aside to let them pass, and Eleanor walked through the doors on Frederick's arm in a daze, unable to quite believe what had just happened, unable to process that a man of his standing had just defended her, had just chosen her company over the approval of a woman whose social power could make or break reputations with a single whispered word. Inside, Clara found them immediately, and drew Eleanor away with apologies about needing her assistance with some domestic matter, leaving Frederick standing in the doorway with rain still glistening on his dark hair. And as Eleanor glanced back over her shoulder, she saw him watching her go with an expression she could not quite read, but that made her pulse race and her carefully constructed walls tremble as though something fundamental was shifting in the architecture of her heart. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The Sinclair townhouse glowed with candlelight on the evening of the musicale, and Eleanor stood in the entrance hall beside her aunt, smoothing the cream silk of her gown with its green ribbons, and wondering how she had allowed herself to be convinced to attend, though she knew the answer lay in the desperate, foolish hope that had taken root in her chest since the garden party, and refused to be extinguished, no matter how sternly she reminded herself that men like Frederick Sinclair did not pursue women like her, except in the novels she devoured by candlelight when sleep would not come. Clara had sent the invitation with a note promising that Frederick had specifically requested Eleanor be included, but Eleanor had dismissed this as her friend's romantic imagination, the same imagination that had once convinced Clara that the butcher's son was secretly a foreign prince. And yet here she stood, her heart beating far too quickly, as a footman took her wrap, and she followed her aunt into the music room where a soprano was warming her voice and guests were arranging themselves on gilt chairs that looked far too delicate for actual human use. She saw him immediately, standing near the fireplace beneath a portrait of a woman whose eyes matched his own, his mother, she supposed. And when his gaze found hers across the crowded room, something flickered in his expression that made her breath catch even as she told herself it meant nothing, that she was reading hope into courtesy, that she would only wound herself further by believing in impossibilities. A man appeared at Frederick's elbow, younger and fairer, with the kind of easy handsomeness that drew female attention like flowers drew bees, and Eleanor watched as this stranger said something that made Frederick's jaw tighten before he turned away and began making his way toward her through the assembled guests with a determination that sent whispers rippling in his wake. "Miss Ashworth," he said when he reached her, and the warmth in his voice was unmistakable. "I am so pleased you could attend, I had hoped. That is, I asked Clara to ensure you received an invitation." And Eleanor felt something crack in the wall around her heart at this admission that he had engineered her presence, that this was not coincidence, but intention. Before she could respond, the fair-haired man appeared beside them, and Frederick's expression cooled as he made the introduction. "My cousin, Lord Marcus Sinclair," and Lord Marcus looked Eleanor up and down with the kind of assessment that made her want to disappear into the wallpaper, before he smiled a smile that did not reach his eyes and said, "Ah, yes, the lady from the assembly. I have heard such amusing stories. Frederick always did have unconventional tastes in entertainment." The word entertainment landed like a slap, but before Eleanor could summon a response, Frederick stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between her and his cousin, and spoke in a voice like winter ice. "Miss Ashworth is my honored guest, Marcus, and I suggest you remember that." And as Lord Marcus retreated with a shrug that pretended indifference, Eleanor looked up at Frederick and saw in his eyes not pity, but something that looked remarkably like admiration. And when he quoted softly a line from her favorite poem, the one about hope being the thing with feathers, she knew with terrifying certainty that whatever was happening between them was real, and that she was already in far too deep to protect herself from the fall. The soprano had finished her third aria, and the guests were stirring from their seats for the interval, seeking refreshment and conversation, when Frederick appeared at Eleanor's side and gestured toward a window alcove hung with blue velvet curtains that offered a measure of privacy from the crowded room, and she followed him there without hesitation, settling onto the cushioned bench as he sat beside her, close enough that she could see the way the candlelight caught the worn gold of his signet ring and the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of too many hours reading by inadequate light. "You mentioned at the garden party that you had spent several years in the north," she said, finding courage in curiosity, and I confess I wondered what drew you there when most gentlemen of your standing seem to find any excuse to remain in London or Bath." His expression shifted into something more guarded, more complex, and for a moment she feared she had trespassed upon forbidden ground. But then he spoke in a voice that carried the weight of memory. "I inherited the estate from my father. 5 years ago," he said. "But it was not only duty that took me north, it was the need to be somewhere that did not remind me at every turn of what I had lost, of who I had failed to protect." And though he did not elaborate, Eleanor heard the grief beneath his words and recognized it as kin to her own, the particular sorrow of those who carry guilt alongside their mourning. She did not press him for details, understanding instinctively that some wounds required time and trust before they could be exposed to another's gaze, and instead she asked about his scholarly interests, drawing him into safer waters where he spoke with growing animation about his translations of classical texts and his correspondence with professors at Edinburgh who took his ideas seriously, despite his lack of formal academic standing. "I have never told anyone in London about my writing," he confessed, his voice dropping lower as though sharing a secret of great importance. "They would think it beneath a man of my position to spend his hours with ink-stained fingers pursuing knowledge that serves no practical purpose," and Eleanor thought of her own hidden novels, her journals filled with observations that no one would ever read, and felt the ache of recognition. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "the impractical pursuits are the ones that reveal who we truly are when we are not performing for society's approval." And the way he looked at her then made her feel seen in a manner that was both thrilling and terrifying in its intensity. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and there was a formality to his tone that made her heart quicken with anticipation. "I wonder if I might have your permission to call upon you, properly, at your aunt's residence." And across the room, Eleanor saw Aunt Harriet watching them with an expression of cautious hope that mirrored her own trembling heart as she heard herself say, "Yes." The drawing-room had never seemed so small as it did on the afternoon of Frederick's first formal call, and Eleanor found herself rearranging the cushions on the settee for the 3rd time, while her aunt watched with barely concealed amusement from her chair by the window where the light was best for her needlework. And when the clock on the mantel chimed 3, Eleanor's heart seized with the sudden conviction that he would not come, that the invitation to call had been mere politeness, that she had spent 3 days building castles in the air, only to watch them crumble as they always did when she allowed herself to hope for things that women like her were not meant to have. The knock at the door made her start so violently that she knocked a small vase of flowers askew, and she was still writing it with trembling hands when the maid announced. Lord Thornbury and Frederick entered the room, carrying a brown paper-wrapped parcel that he held with a care that suggested its contents were precious, and when his eyes found hers, Eleanor saw something that looked remarkably like relief, as though he too had feared this moment might not arrive. "Lady Greville, Miss Ashworth," he said with proper formality, even as his gaze lingered on Eleanor longer than strict propriety allowed. "I hope I am not intruding," and Aunt Harriet assured him he was most welcome with a warmth that made Eleanor's cheeks flush, because she knew her aunt was all ready calculating wedding dates and guest lists, despite Eleanor's repeated warnings not to hope. Frederick took the chair Eleanor indicated, the one with the worn arm that she had worried over all morning, but if he noticed the shabbiness of their furnishings, he gave no sign, his attention fixed instead on presenting her with the parcel he had carried so carefully. "I recalled our conversation about natural philosophy," he said, "and thought you might find this of interest." And when Eleanor unwrapped the paper to reveal a beautifully bound volume on botanical illustration, her throat tightened with an emotion she could not name, because no one, no man, certainly, had ever given her a gift that acknowledged her mind rather than attempting to ornament her body. The tea service arrived, the pot with its small chip turned carefully away from their guest, though Eleanor caught Frederick's eyes pass over it without judgment, and as Aunt Harriet poured and made pleasant conversation about the weather, Eleanor marveled at how easily Frederick navigated the modest circumstances of their home, how he praised the tea, though it was not the finest blend, and admired the view from the window, though it showed only a narrow street. When the talk turned to society and its endless judgments, Frederick's expression grew thoughtful, and he said quietly, "I have observed that the ton values appearance above substance, fortune above character, and connection above merit, which leads me to believe that society is often profoundly wrong about what matters." And the way he looked at Eleanor as he spoke left no doubt that he was talking about her, about how the world had dismissed her, and about how thoroughly he disagreed with that assessment. The fashionable hour in Hyde Park had drawn the usual parade of carriages and promenaders, ladies in their finest spring ensembles, and gentlemen on horseback performing the elaborate ritual of seeing and being seen that constituted so much of London society, and Eleanor felt acutely aware of every glance that slid toward her and Frederick as they walked together along the path where cherry blossoms drifted down like pink snow, her blue Spencer jacket modest compared to the elaborate confections worn by the young debutantes who passed them with curious stares. And she could not shake the conviction that people were wondering what a man of Frederick's standing was doing, walking so publicly with a woman the ton had long since dismissed as unmarriageable. Yet when she stole a glance at his profile, she saw only calm determination, as though he were making a statement with every step they took together, and did not care who observed it. His groom waited some distance away with Frederick's horse, a beautiful bay that stamped impatiently. But Frederick showed no inclination to cut short their walk, instead pointing out the early blooming flowers and speaking of his plans for the gardens at Thornbury with an ease that made Eleanor's heart ache with longing for a future she dared not envision. They had nearly completed their circuit when Lady Beatrice Langdon appeared with her entourage of admirers, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with undisguised interest, and Eleanor felt herself tense as the woman's gaze swept over her with the familiar assessment that always found her wanting. But Frederick merely inclined his head in minimal acknowledgement and guided Eleanor past without pausing for conversation, a slight that would surely fuel gossip for days. It was near the Serpentine that Sir Thomas Ravenscroft materialized as though summoned by Eleanor's worst fears, his smile carrying the particular smugness of a man who believed himself superior to all around him, and he addressed Frederick with false cordiality, while his eyes lingered on Eleanor with something between resentment and calculation. "I see you are keeping unusual company, Thornbury," Sir Thomas remarked with deliberate emphasis on the word unusual. "One might almost think you were making a charitable project of our Miss Ashworth," and Eleanor felt the words strike her like physical blows. But before she could summon a response, Frederick stepped slightly forward, his voice carrying the quiet authority of generations of privilege wielded without apology. "I keep the company of those I find worthy, Sir Thomas," he said with ice beneath the civility, "and I suggest you concern yourself with your own affairs, rather than presuming to comment on mine," and the dismissal was so complete, so devastatingly final, that Sir Thomas could only sputter before retreating with what dignity he could salvage. Frederick turned back to Eleanor, and in full view of anyone who cared to observe, he took her gloved hand and tucked it more securely into the crook of his arm, his fingers pressing warmth through the fabric as cherry blossoms settled in her hair, and she understood that he was choosing her, publicly, deliberately, in defiance of every expectation society held. The rain had returned by the time Eleanor closed her bedroom door behind her, the sound of it against the windows a familiar companion to her solitary evenings, and she stood for a long moment with her back pressed against the wood, as though she needed its solid support to keep herself upright after the afternoon's overwhelming events, her mind replaying every moment in Hyde Park with Frederick until she could no longer distinguish between what had actually occurred and what her desperate heart wished to believe. She moved to her dressing table and sat heavily, avoiding her own reflection in the mirror as she had learned to do years ago when she first understood that mirrors showed only the outside of a person, and the outside of Eleanor. Ashworth had never been anything society wished to see, not when she was a girl whose father sighed each time he looked at her, because she was not the son he needed, not when she was a young woman whose mother died whispering apologies that she had not managed to give her husband an heir before the fever took her, and certainly not now when she was 28 years old and built on lines that fashion deemed unacceptable. The book Frederick had given her sat on her nightstand beside her mother's miniature portrait, and Eleanor reached for it with trembling fingers, opening to a random page as though seeking some oracle in its text, some confirmation that what she had felt when he tucked her hand into his arm and faced down Sir Thomas Ravenscroft was real, and not merely the elaborate fiction of a lonely woman who had forgotten how to hope. He had chosen her publicly, deliberately, in full view of everyone who had ever whispered that Eleanor Ashworth was too large, too old, too sharp-tongued to deserve the happiness that came so easily to prettier girls with smaller waists and sweeter dispositions. And yet even as her heart soared at the memory, her mind began its familiar work of dismantling joy before it could disappoint her. Perhaps he was merely kind, she told herself. Perhaps defending her had been the act of a gentleman who could not stomach Sir Thomas's boorishness rather than any particular regard for Eleanor herself. Perhaps tomorrow he would wake and realize what a spectacle he had made walking with her where anyone could see, and she would become simply another awkward memory from a season he would rather forget. She forced herself finally to look in the mirror, cataloguing with brutal honesty the round face that would never be called classical, the shoulders that filled her gowns more fully than modistes preferred, the body that took up space in a world that wanted women to diminish themselves, and she whispered to her reflection the question that had haunted her since girlhood. Who could truly want this? Who could look at all of this and choose it willingly? And the rain continued its steady percussion against the glass as Eleanor Ashworth sat alone with her impossible hope and her ancient wounds, and wondered if she had finally found someone who saw her clearly and wanted her anyway, or if she was simply building another castle destined to crumble into dust. Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly had always been Eleanor's sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself among the leather-bound volumes and forget for a few precious hours that the world outside judged her by the circumference of her waist rather than the contents of her mind. And she had come here 4 days after the walk in Hyde Park, seeking exactly that refuge, needing to quiet the relentless voice in her head that insisted she had imagined Frederick's regard, and would soon discover it had been nothing more than a gentleman's passing kindness to an unfortunate spinster. The shop smelled of leather and dust and possibility, that particular perfume of knowledge waiting to be discovered, and Eleanor had positioned herself in the back corner where the Gothic novels lived, running her fingers along spines that promised heroines in peril and mysteries in crumbling castles. When she heard a voice she would have recognized anywhere, speak her name with unmistakable warmth and genuine surprise. She turned to find Frederick standing in the narrow aisle, holding a volume of Greek philosophy, his expression shifting from scholarly abstraction to something that looked remarkably like delight, and Eleanor's heart performed the now familiar acrobatics it had learned in his presence, even as her mind scrambled to understand how he could be here in this precise moment when she had told no one of her plans to visit. "I did not arrange this," he said as though reading her suspicion. "I confess I have arranged other meetings, but this one belongs entirely to fate or fortune or whatever force governs the alignment of two people who perhaps think too much and feel too deeply." And Eleanor found herself laughing, despite her determination to remain guarded, because there was something so unexpectedly vulnerable in his admission that he had engineered their previous encounters. They stood together in that dusty corner as the afternoon light slanted through the shop windows, and Frederick spoke of things he had never told anyone, his ambition to write a philosophical treatise on the nature of obligation and freedom, the essays he had drafted during his years in the North, when loneliness had driven him to fill pages with thoughts he feared would seem pretentious if spoken aloud, and Eleanor listened with growing wonder as this man, who could have spent his days in idle aristocratic pleasure, revealed instead a mind hungry for meaning and a heart terrified of judgment. "You should write it," she told him with a conviction that surprised them both. "The world has enough gentlemen who contribute nothing beyond their presence at parties and their opinions on horseflesh. It needs more who think deeply and dare to share what they discover." And she watched something shift in his face as though no one had ever before given him permission to pursue the work that mattered most to him. He looked at her then with an intensity that made her breath catch, and Eleanor understood that in encouraging his dreams she had offered him something no one else had thought to give. And perhaps that was what connection truly meant, not simply being seen, but seeing in return. Not only receiving recognition, but offering it freely to another wounded soul who had waited too long for someone to believe in the person they secretly hoped to become. The carriage wheels crunched against the gravel drive of Thornbury Hall as Eleanor pressed her face closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she caught her first glimpse of Frederick's ancestral home rising against the evening sky like something from the Gothic novels she secretly adored. All golden stone and mullioned windows catching the last amber light of a May sunset. And she felt her stomach tighten with a mixture of wonder and dread, because this grand estate, with its manicured gardens and ancient oaks, belonged to a world she had never truly inhabited, a world where her modest trunk now sat among the fine leather luggage of guests who would undoubtedly wonder why Miss Eleanor Ashworth had been included in such distinguished company. Clara had arranged the invitation with characteristic determination, insisting that Eleanor needed country air and that her husband's cousin would be a gracious host. But Eleanor understood the true architecture of this weekend, and it terrified her almost as much as it thrilled her, for Frederick had wanted her here in his home, among his things, walking the grounds where he had grown from boy to man, and that wanting meant something she was still afraid to name. The great hall swallowed her as she entered, all polished oak and ancestral portraits, staring down with the particular judgment of the long dead. And Eleanor clutched her reticule as though it might anchor her to some version of herself that belonged in such surroundings, while servants moved her modest belongings toward a guest chamber that probably cost more to furnish than her entire London wardrobe. She noticed Lady Beatrice Langdon already installed by the fireplace, holding court among several elegant young women who turned to assess Eleanor's arrival with the practiced cruelty of those who understood exactly where everyone ranked in the invisible hierarchy of worth. And Eleanor lifted her chin in the way she had learned deflected some of the sharper arrows, even as her heart sank at the realization that this weekend would offer no refuge from society's constant measurement of her inadequacy. Frederick appeared then, as though summoned by her distress, crossing the hall with a warmth in his expression that she still could not quite believe was meant for her, and he welcomed her with such genuine pleasure that several of the watching ladies exchanged glances weighted with speculation and barely concealed contempt. He insisted on showing her the library himself before she retired to dress for dinner, leading her through corridors lined with his family's history, until they stood in a room that smelled of leather and beeswax and contained more books than Eleanor had seen outside of Hatchard's, and she understood immediately that this was his sanctuary, the heart of the house where he had hidden as a boy and retreated as a man, and he was giving her access to it as deliberately as he had given her the book of natural philosophy. A portrait hung near the window, a young man with Frederick's eyes but a more reckless set to his jaw, and Eleanor saw Frederick's gaze catch on it for a moment before he looked away, and she filed that grief alongside all the other pieces of him she was slowly collecting, building a picture of the man she was beginning to love, in defiance of every voice that insisted she had no right to imagine herself worthy of such a future within these ancient walls. The breakfast room at Thornbury Hall gleamed with morning light that poured through tall windows overlooking the rose garden, casting golden rectangles across the mahogany table where Eleanor sat nursing a cup of tea she had barely tasted, acutely aware that every bite she took was being catalogued by the three elegant young women seated across from her who had spent the previous evening whispering behind their fans whenever she passed, and she had chosen her best morning dress for this meal, a soft muslin in pale yellow that her aunt had insisted was flattering, but surrounded by the silks and embroidered muslins of ladies whose wardrobes cost more than her entire annual income. Eleanor felt precisely as provincial and unremarkable as she knew they believed her to be. Lady Beatrice held court at the far end of the table, her voice carrying with calculated precision as she discussed the previous season's most advantageous matches, her gaze sliding toward Eleanor with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever, and Eleanor focused on buttering a piece of toast she had no intention of eating, simply to give her hands something to do besides tremble with the particular exhaustion of being constantly measured and found wanting. Frederick entered the breakfast room like a man with purpose, his eyes scanning the assembled guests with perfunctory politeness, before finding Eleanor and softening in a way that made her chest ache with hope she still did not trust, and she watched him take a seat near the head of the table where a footman immediately poured his coffee, a cup that would grow cold because Frederick seemed incapable of looking anywhere but at her, despite the pointed attempts of Miss Amelia Carstairs to engage him in conversation about the morning's planned activities. The room hummed with tension. Eleanor could feel against her skin. The other female guests exchanging glances waited with speculation and resentment as Frederick rose from his barely touched breakfast and crossed to where Eleanor sat, his voice warm and unhurried as he asked if she might do him the honor of walking in the gardens before the day grew too warm, and Eleanor heard the sharp intake of breath from Lady Beatrice, saw the flush of anger on Miss Carstairs's carefully powdered cheeks, understood with perfect clarity that accepting this invitation in front of witnesses would mark her as a woman who had somehow captured the attention of the most eligible man in the room when she had no right to such fortune. She could refuse, could claim fatigue or a headache, or any of the convenient feminine ailments that would allow her to retreat to safety. But Frederick was looking at her with such open hope, such genuine desire for her company, that Eleanor found herself setting down her teacup and rising from her chair with a dignity she had not known she possessed, her voice steady as she accepted his invitation and took the arm he offered, walking past the hostile stares and whispered commentary with her chin held high, because whatever came next, whatever disappointment surely awaited, she would have this moment of choosing courage over fear, of allowing herself to be seen wanting something beautiful, even if the world believed she had no right to want it at all. The gardens of Thornbury Hall unfolded before Eleanor like a living painting, as Frederick guided her along gravel paths lined with roses just beginning to unfurl their petals, and she found herself breathless not from exertion, but from the weight of possibility pressing against her ribs, the awareness that they were alone together in this beautiful place where he had grown up, where he had learned to walk and ride and grieve, and she did not know what to do with the tenderness that swelled in her chest when he pointed out the oak tree he had climbed as a boy, or the garden folly where he had hidden to read when his tutors sought him for lessons he found tedious. They walked in companionable silence for several minutes until they reached a stone bench overlooking a small lake where swans glided across water that reflected the morning sky like polished silver, and Frederick gestured for her to sit before lowering himself beside her with a heaviness that seemed to have nothing to do with physical weariness, and Eleanor watched his profile as he stared out at the swans with an expression she had not seen before, something raw and unguarded that made her want to reach for his hand, though she kept her fingers firmly clasped in her lap. He spoke then of his brother James, the young man in the portrait she had noticed the evening before, and his voice carried a grief so profound that Eleanor felt tears prick her own eyes as he described the riding accident 4 years ago, the fence that should have been easily cleared, the horse that stumbled on rain-softened ground, the terrible stillness of his brother's body when Frederick reached him moments too late to do anything but hold him as he died. Eleanor listened as Frederick confessed what he had never told anyone else, that he had been the one to suggest they race that morning, that he had teased James about his caution until his younger brother had something to prove, that every morning since he had awakened with the knowledge that his careless words had cost James his life, and when his voice finally broke on a sound that was almost a sob, Eleanor did what she had never imagined herself bold enough to do, and reached across the space between them to take his hand in hers, feeling his fingers tighten around hers, with desperate gratitude as though she had thrown him a rope when he was drowning. She told him that grief was not the same as guilt, that loving someone meant wanting them to be brave and free and alive in all the ways that mattered, that James had made his own choice to take that fence, and would not want his brother to carry this burden like a penance for the rest of his days. And Frederick turned to look at her with such raw wonder that Eleanor felt her heart crack open in a way she had spent 28 years protecting herself against, and he lifted his free hand to touch her cheek with trembling fingers, his lips parting to speak words that Eleanor somehow knew would change everything. When the distant sound of laughter carried across the garden, and Frederick pulled back with an expression of frustrated resignation as the other guests spilled onto the lawn for the morning's planned activities, leaving Eleanor sitting on that stone bench with her hand still warm from his touch and her heart suspended between terror and hope. The afternoon stretched before Eleanor like a test she had not studied for. The house party guests assembled on the sprawling south lawn, where servants had arranged targets for archery and footmen circulated with glasses of lemonade that sweated in the unexpected warmth of the May sunshine, and she stood at the edge of the gathering with her hands clasped tightly together, still feeling the phantom pressure of Frederick's fingers around hers from that morning by the lake, still hearing the raw crack in his voice when he spoke of his brother, still wondering if she had dreamed the way he had looked at her before the other guests shattered their solitude with their careless laughter and demands for entertainment. She watched Frederick now from across the field where he stood instructing Miss Carstairs on the proper way to hold a bow, his posture correct and distant in a way that seemed nothing like the man who had wept before her just hours ago, and Eleanor felt the familiar cold creep of doubt slithering through her chest as she wondered whether the intimacy of that morning had been nothing more than a moment of weakness. He now regretted whether she had been merely a convenient witness to grief he wished he had not shared with someone so far beneath his station. Lord Marcus appeared at her elbow like a spectre summoned by her insecurity, his smile too wide and his eyes too knowing. As he offered her a glass of lemonade she did not want but accepted, because refusing would require a conversation she lacked the energy to conduct, and he stood too close as he observed his cousin across the lawn with an expression that made Eleanor's stomach clench with foreboding. He spoke then in a voice pitched low enough that only she could hear, words that slid like poison into the fragile hope she had been nurturing, telling her that Frederick had always been soft-hearted and prone to collecting wounded creatures, that she should not mistake his kindness for anything more significant, that a man of his position could never seriously consider a woman of her circumstances and her particular physical attributes, no matter how amusing he found her conversation. Eleanor's hands began to shake so violently that the lemonade sloshed over the rim of her glass, and Lord Marcus smiled with satisfaction at the effect of his cruelty, adding that she should enjoy the attention while it lasted, because once they returned to London, Frederick would remember his obligations to his title and his family name, obligations that required a wife who could move through society without becoming the subject of whispered ridicule and pitying glances. He left her standing there with her lemonade growing warm and her heart growing cold, and when Eleanor looked across the field, she saw Frederick watching her with concern creasing his brow, saw him take a step in her direction before Lady Beatrice intercepted him with a question that required his attention, and Eleanor turned away before he could see the tears she refused to let fall, retreating toward the house with the measured pace of a woman who had learned long ago that running only made the hunters more eager to chase. The library at Thornbury Hall was dim when Eleanor slipped through its heavy oak doors that evening, lit only by a single candelabra that cast flickering shadows across the spines of thousands of books she would never have the chance to read, and she stood in the amber glow with her arms wrapped around herself, as though she could physically hold together the pieces of her heart that Lord Marcus had so efficiently shattered with his casual cruelty that afternoon, and she was contemplating whether she could plead illness and have a carriage summoned to take her back to London before dinner, when the door opened behind her and Frederick's voice cut through the silence like a blade, asking why she had been avoiding him since the archery, and why she had looked at him across the lawn as though he had betrayed her in some way she would not name. Eleanor did not turn to face him, because she knew that if she saw the concern in his eyes, she would crumble, and instead she stared at the shelves before her, where she could see the familiar spine of the natural philosophy book he had given her weeks ago in her aunt's modest drawing-room, and she told him in a voice she barely recognized as her own that someone had reminded her of certain realities she had foolishly allowed herself to forget, that a man in his position had obligations and expectations that did not include women like her, that she understood now she had been a temporary diversion, and she thanked him for his kindness, but would trouble him no further. The sound Frederick made was almost a growl as he crossed the room in 3 long strides and took her shoulders in his hands, turning her to face him with a gentleness that contradicted the anger blazing in his dark eyes. And he demanded to know who had spoken such poison to her, who had dared to tell her what he could and could not feel, who had presumed to speak for his heart when his heart had been hers since the moment he watched her tell Sir Thomas Ravenscroft that he should talk less. Eleanor felt the tears she had been refusing to shed all afternoon finally spill down her cheeks as Frederick cupped her face in his hands and told her that she was worth more than every simpering debutante in every ballroom in England, that her mind challenged him and her spirit delighted him and her form was exactly as it should be because it was hers, that he had spent 32 years believing he did not deserve happiness after what happened to James, and then she had held his hand by the lake and told him he was allowed to live, and he had known in that moment that he wanted to spend every remaining day of his life proving to her that she was seen and valued and desperately wanted. He kissed her then, with the single candelabra painting them both in gold, his lips gentle against hers at first, and then deeper when she responded with all the longing she had been suppressing for weeks. And Eleanor was lost in the taste of him and the strength of his arms around her when the dinner bell rang through the house like a summons from a world she had briefly forgotten existed, and Frederick pulled back with his forehead pressed against hers and whispered that this conversation was not finished. The dining room at Thornbury Hall glittered with candlelight that caught the crystal and silver arranged along the endless mahogany table, and Eleanor took her seat at the far end with her heart still racing from the kiss in the library and her lips still tingling with the memory of Frederick's mouth against hers, and she understood immediately when she saw the seating arrangement that Lady Beatrice had exercised her influence as the highest-ranking female guest to ensure that Eleanor would be as far from Frederick as the geometry of the table allowed, positioned between a deaf elderly baron who spoke only of his hunting dogs and a young clergyman who blushed crimson every time he glanced at her décolletage, and then stared fixedly at his soup as though it contained the secrets of salvation. Frederick sat at the head of the table as host, and Eleanor watched him take his place with that careful composure she now recognized as a mask he wore for society, and when his eyes found hers across the expanse of white linen and flickering flames, she felt the connection between them like a physical thread pulled taut, and he gave her the smallest nod that somehow conveyed everything he could not say aloud in this room full of people who would dissect their every interaction for gossip to carry back to London. Lady Beatrice leaned toward Lord Marcus with her fan fluttering and her voice carrying just far enough for Eleanor to catch fragments about inappropriate attachments and temporary fancies and the inevitable disappointment that awaited women who forgot their place. And Eleanor forced herself to lift her wine glass with a steady hand even as her stomach churned too violently to contemplate the roasted pheasant being placed before her. The meal progressed through endless courses that Eleanor barely tasted, and she responded to the deaf baron's monologues about his favourite hound with mechanical politeness, while her awareness remained fixed on Frederick at the distant head of the table, watching him perform the duties of host with a restlessness she could now read in the tension of his shoulders and the way his fingers drummed once against the tablecloth before he caught himself. And every time their eyes met across the candle-lit distance, she felt the echo of his voice in the library, telling her she was worth more than every simpering debutante in England, felt his hands cupping her face as though she were something precious rather than something to be pitied. Lord Marcus caught her looking, and smiled that knowing smile that made her skin crawl, and Eleanor looked away quickly, but not before she saw him whisper something to Lady Beatrice that made the older woman laugh behind her fan with malicious delight, and Eleanor understood then that the battle for Frederick's regard would not be won in private moments alone, but in the public arena where society would judge whether she deserved to stand beside him. When dinner finally ended and the ladies rose to withdraw, Frederick caught her hand as she passed his chair, the touch lasting only a heartbeat, but his thumb pressing against her pulse point in silent promise. The carriage ride back to London had been an agony of silence and speculation, with Eleanor pressing her forehead against the cool glass of the window and watching the countryside give way to the crowded streets of the city, while her aunt made gentle conversation that required only the barest responses. And now 2 days had passed since they had returned to the modest house on Half Moon Street, and Eleanor had worn a path in the drawing-room carpet, waiting for a card to arrive or a knock to sound at the door announcing Frederick's presence. But the hours stretched into emptiness, and she found herself constructing elaborate explanations for his absence that all ended with the same conclusion, that the intimacy of the library and the promise in his eyes at dinner had been the fever dream of a country weekend, and now that he was back among his London obligations, he had remembered all the reasons why a viscount should not entangle himself with a woman of her circumstances and her figure and her sharp, unguarded tongue. She was standing at the window watching the street when the knock finally came, and her heart leaped so violently that she pressed her hand against her chest to contain it. But when the maid opened the door, it was not Frederick's tall, familiar form that filled the doorway, but Sir Thomas Ravenscroft, with his thinning hair pomaded flat against his skull and his wine-stained cravat that seemed to be a permanent feature of his wardrobe. And Eleanor felt her hope curdle into something between despair and fury as he swept into the room with the confidence of a man who believed persistence would eventually wear down any resistance. Sir Thomas settled himself in the best chair without invitation and announced that he had heard certain rumours about Eleanor and Lord Thornbury, that he understood young women were susceptible to flattery from men of higher rank, but that he was here to offer her a sensible alternative, a man who would not eventually tire of the novelty and leave her reputation in tatters, a man who appreciated her inheritance, if not her person, and was willing to overlook her more obvious deficiencies in exchange for the comfortable arrangement marriage would provide. Eleanor listened to his speech with a strange calm settling over her, and when he finished, she rose from her seat and looked down at him with all the composure she had learned in those agonizing weeks of ballrooms and garden parties and whispered cruelties. And she told him that she would rather live alone in a cottage with only her books and her aunt for company until she was 90 years old than spend a single day as his wife, that she had finally learned what it felt like to be valued for her mind and her spirit, rather than merely tolerated for her fortune, and that if Frederick Sinclair never called on her again, she would still carry the knowledge that she deserved more than Sir Thomas could ever offer. Her aunt was standing in the doorway with tears of pride glistening in her eyes as Sir Thomas sputtered and rose and departed without another word, and Eleanor discovered that refusing him felt like the first truly brave thing she had ever done entirely for herself. The morning after Sir Thomas's departure dawned grey and uncertain, and Eleanor found herself asked to settle to any occupation, picking up her embroidery only to set it down after 3 stitches, opening the book Frederick had given her only to read the same sentence 5 times without comprehension, until finally she simply sat in the window seat and watched the street below with an attention that made her aunt sigh and busy herself with correspondence rather than comment on her niece's obvious agitation. By noon, Eleanor had convinced herself that Frederick's silence was confirmation of everything Lord Marcus had whispered on the archery lawn, that the kiss in the library had been a moment of madness that Frederick now regretted, that she had been a fool to refuse Sir Thomas when he at least had the virtue of honesty about his mercenary motives, and she was composing a mental letter to Clara, asking if she might visit the country early when the sound of hoofbeats stopping outside made her heart stutter and her fingers grip the windowsill until her knuckles went white. Frederick descended from his horse with that particular grace she had come to recognize, and even from above she could see the tension in his shoulders and the way he took the steps to their door 2 at a time, and Eleanor was on her feet before she realized she had moved, smoothing her hair and her dress with hands that trembled despite all her efforts to appear composed. The maid announced him, and then he was there in the modest drawing-room that suddenly seemed smaller with his presence filling it, and Eleanor saw immediately that something had changed in his expression, a determination that had replaced the careful restraint he usually wore in company. And when Aunt Harriet rose to greet him, he barely completed the courtesies before turning to Eleanor with an intensity that made her breath catch. He told her that he had been delayed by his solicitor, and by business he could not postpone, that he had spent every moment of the past 2 days putting his affairs in order, because he refused to come to her with anything less than absolute certainty about what he was offering, and Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly as she understood what he was saying. Frederick crossed the space between them and took her hands in his, and she noticed that his fingers were not entirely steady either, and he said that he had spent 32 years believing that duty and guilt were the only emotions he deserved to feel, that his brother's death had taught him to want nothing for himself, but that Eleanor had dismantled every wall he had built with her wit and her warmth and her refusal to be anything other than exactly who she was. He told her that he had heard about Sir Thomas's visit from Clara, that he had nearly ridden through the night when he learned another man had dared to press his suit, and Eleanor laughed through the tears she could no longer contain because the jealousy in his voice was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. When he asked her to be his wife, his Viscountess, his partner in all things, she said yes before he had finished speaking. The news of Lord Thornbury's engagement to Miss Eleanor Ashworth spread through London society with the speed of a summer wildfire, and Eleanor found herself transformed overnight from an object of pity and derision into a subject of intense fascination and barely concealed envy, though she suspected that much of the attention she now received was less admiration than astonishment, that a woman of her size and her age and her sharp, unguarded tongue had somehow captured one of the most eligible men in England. Lady Beatrice Langdon was among the first to call, sweeping into Aunt Harriet's modest drawing-room with an expression of determined sweetness that fooled no one, and Eleanor received her with a composure she had not known she possessed, offering tea and conversation as though Lady Beatrice had not spent the entire season whispering cruelties behind her fan and ensuring that Eleanor's humiliations were witnessed by the maximum possible audience. The visit was brief and pointed, Lady Beatrice fishing for details about the courtship and the proposal and the wedding plans, while Eleanor offered nothing but serene pleasantries. And when Lady Beatrice finally departed with her curiosity unsatisfied, Aunt Harriet burst into laughter that brought tears to her eyes and declared that she had never been prouder of her niece than in that moment of gracious triumph. Frederick called every day now, sometimes twice, and Eleanor marvelled at how different the world looked when viewed from the shelter of his regard, how the whispers that had once cut her to the bone now seemed to slide off like rain from oiled cloth, how she could meet the eyes of women who had snubbed her and feel not shame, but something close to pity for the smallness of their understanding. Clara came to help with wedding preparations, her pregnancy now advanced enough that she moved carefully and rested often, and the two friends spent long afternoons discussing flowers and music and guest lists, while Clara repeatedly marvelled at how thoroughly Eleanor had transformed from the resigned and guarded woman who had arrived in London just weeks before. But it was the quiet moments Eleanor treasured most, the evenings when Frederick sat in Aunt Harriet's drawing-room with a book in his hands, and Eleanor beside him with her own reading, the two of them exchanging glances and occasional comments in a companionable silence that felt like a preview of their future together. And she would catch herself watching his profile in the candlelight, and wondering how she had ever believed that happiness like this was meant for other women, and not for her. Frederick told her one evening that he had spoken to Lord Marcus, that his cousin would not be welcome at the wedding or at Thornbury thereafter, and Eleanor felt something ease in her chest that she had not realized was still clenched tight, the knowledge that Frederick had chosen her not just with pretty words, but with action, cutting away those who had wounded her regardless of the family connection. She was learning, slowly and with occasional setbacks, to believe that she deserved this, that Frederick's love was not a mistake he would eventually recognize, but a choice he made with full knowledge of who she was. The wedding took place on a morning in early June, when the sky was impossibly blue and the air carried the scent of roses from the garden, where Eleanor had first truly spoken with Frederick, and she walked down the aisle of the small church near Thornbury on her aunt's arm, because there was no father to give her away, wearing a gown of ivory silk that Clara had helped her choose, and that made her feel, for the first time in her memory, genuinely beautiful rather than merely acceptably dressed. Frederick waited at the altar with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something raw and unguarded that made her stumble slightly on the worn stone floor, and when she reached him, he took her hands and held them as though she were something precious beyond measure, and she heard Lady Beatrice somewhere behind her make a small sound of disbelief that Eleanor chose to interpret as grudging acknowledgement of defeat. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of ancient words and candlelight, and the weight of Frederick's signet ring sliding onto her finger beside the delicate band he had chosen for her. And when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Frederick kissed her with a tenderness that made her forget entirely that they stood before an audience of 50 witnesses who had come partly to celebrate and partly to see for themselves if the rumours were true. The wedding breakfast at Thornbury was smaller than society expected for a viscount's marriage, but Eleanor had insisted on intimacy over spectacle, and Frederick had agreed with visible relief, and they sat together at the head of the table while Clara wept happy tears and Aunt Harriet beamed with a satisfaction that bordered on smugness, and even the guests who had whispered cruelties mere weeks before raised their glasses with expressions approaching genuine goodwill. It was Clara who caught the small bouquet Eleanor tossed, laughing and protesting that she was already married and already expecting. And Eleanor watched her dearest friend and felt her heart swell with a gratitude so vast it threatened to overwhelm her. Gratitude for friendship that had never wavered, for an aunt who had believed in her, for a man who had seen through every defense she had built and loved what he found beneath. That night in the master chamber at Thornbury, the room that would now be hers, Eleanor stood before the mirror in her nightdress and watched Frederick approach behind her, his reflection meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. And when he wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her back against his chest, she did not flinch or try to hide herself, but instead leaned into his warmth and let herself be held. He told her she was beautiful, and she believed him, not because she had suddenly transformed into the slender ideal society demanded, but because she had finally understood that beauty was not a fixed standard, but a recognition, a seeing. And Frederick saw her completely, and found her worthy of love. They came together that night as husband and wife, with tenderness and passion and occasional awkwardness that made them both laugh. And Eleanor discovered that joy could be physical as well as emotional, that her body was capable of pleasure she had never imagined, that Frederick's hands on her skin made her feel cherished rather than ashamed. The summer months at Thornbury passed in a golden haze of discovery and deepening love, and Eleanor found herself settling into her role as Viscountess with a grace that surprised no one more than herself, learning the rhythms of the great house and its staff, the traditions that Frederick's family had maintained for generations, the quiet responsibilities that came with managing an estate that employed dozens of families in the surrounding village. She had feared, in the anxious weeks before the wedding, that she would feel like an impostor in these grand halls, that the servants would see through her modest origins and find her wanting. But instead, she discovered that competence and kindness mattered far more than pedigree, that the housekeeper Mrs. Aldridge responded to genuine interest in her work with fierce loyalty, that the tenants who came to pay their respects saw not her figure or her lack of fashionable connections, but a new mistress who listened to their concerns and remembered their children's names. Frederick watched her transformation with undisguised pride, telling her one evening as they walked through the gardens that he had known she would be magnificent, but had not anticipated quite how thoroughly she would make Thornbury her own. And Eleanor had laughed and told him he was biased, and he had agreed without hesitation, and kissed her beneath the rose arbor where they had first spoken of love. Aunt Harriet came to stay for a fortnight in August, and Eleanor delighted in showing her the library where she now spent her mornings, the morning room that Frederick had redecorated in colours she had chosen, the suite of rooms that would always be kept ready for her aunt's visits, and Harriet had wept quietly and told Eleanor that her mother would have been so proud, so impossibly proud, of the woman her daughter had become. The news came in September, delivered first by her own body's changes, and then confirmed by the physician Frederick insisted on summoning from London, and Eleanor sat in the window seat of her bedchamber and placed her hands on her still, flat stomach. and felt something shift inside her that had nothing to do with the tiny life beginning to grow there. A final unlocking of the last guarded chamber of her heart. A willingness to believe at last that happiness was not a loan to be called in, but a gift she had earned through the simple courage of remaining herself when the world had demanded she become smaller. She told Frederick that evening in the library, watching his face move through shock and joy and something that looked almost like fear before settling into a tenderness so profound that she felt tears slip down her cheeks, and he knelt before her chair and pressed his forehead to her hands and whispered that she had given him everything, everything he had never dared hope for, a future that held more than duty and guilt, a family built on love rather than obligation. The child would come in spring, the physician said, and Eleanor thought of new beginnings and seasons turning, and the way that hope, once planted, could grow beyond anything she had imagined possible. The winter passed in quiet contentment at Thornbury, with Eleanor growing rounder as the months advanced and Frederick hovering with a protective tenderness that she found both touching and occasionally exasperating, insisting she rest when she felt perfectly capable of walking, summoning the physician at every slight discomfort, reading aloud to her in the evenings from the books they both loved, while the fire crackled and snow fell softly beyond the windows. She had never imagined that pregnancy would suit her, had expected to feel even more cumbersome than before, but instead she found a strange peace in her changing body, a sense of purpose that transcended the old shame. And when she caught Frederick watching her with that expression of wondering gratitude, she felt beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with society's narrow definitions and everything to do with being seen, truly seen, by someone who loved her completely. Clara came to stay in February, her own child now 6 months old and thriving, and the two women spent long afternoons in the sunny morning room while their husbands retreated to the library, talking of motherhood and marriage and the unexpected turns their lives had taken since that spring assembly, where Eleanor had stood alone at the refreshment table and wondered if she would ever be anything other than invisible. The baby came on a warm April morning, exactly 1 year after Eleanor had first walked into the Hartfield Assembly in her unfashionable green silk dress, and the labor was long and difficult, but Frederick never left the hallway outside her door, pacing and praying and driving the servants to distraction with his constant questions. And when the midwife finally emerged with a small wrapped bundle and placed it in his arms, he wept openly and without shame. This reserved man who had once hidden his heart from the world. They named her Margaret, after Eleanor's mother, and she had her father's dark eyes and her mother's determined chin. And when Eleanor held her daughter for the first time, she understood at last what her own mother must have felt, that fierce protective love that would burn down the world to keep this small creature safe. Frederick sat beside her on the bed, one arm around his wife and one hand resting gently on his daughter's head, and told Eleanor that she had given him everything he had lost when his brother died: a family, a future, a reason to believe that joy was not something that happened to other people, but something he was allowed to claim for himself. The gossip about their marriage had faded over the winter months, replaced by newer scandals and fresher targets, and when word spread of the new Sinclair heir, even Lady Beatrice sent a card of congratulations that contained only the faintest hint of condescension, which Eleanor chose to interpret as growth. Aunt Harriet arrived within the week, taking one look at her great niece and declaring that she had never seen a more perfect child. And Eleanor watched her aunt hold Margaret in the same arms that had held Eleanor herself through grief and disappointment and the long years of waiting, and felt the circle complete itself in ways she had never dared to imagine possible. The years that followed Margaret's birth unfolded like the pages of a book Eleanor had never dared to write for herself, each chapter bringing new joys she had once believed were meant for other women, women who were smaller and quieter and more willing to diminish themselves for the comfort of a world that had never much cared for her comfort at all. A second child came 2 years after the first, a son they named William for Frederick's father, And then a third, another daughter called Harriet, for the aunt who had never stopped believing that Eleanor deserved every happiness, and Thornbury filled with the sounds of children's laughter and running feet and the particular chaos that comes from a house built on love rather than appearances. Frederick published his book of philosophy in 1820, dedicating it to his wife who had taught him that the mind's truest work was not escape from feeling but engagement with it. And Eleanor had wept when she read those words and kissed him soundly in his study, while their children played in the garden below, and the servants pretended not to notice their master and mistress behaving like newlyweds still. Lady Beatrice Langdon's husband lost his fortune in a shipping venture gone wrong the year Margaret turned 5, and Eleanor took no pleasure in her former tormentor's downfall, but neither did she offer false sympathy when they encountered each other at a London assembly, merely nodding with the distant politeness that she had once received, and moving on to more pleasant company. Sir Thomas Ravenscroft married an heiress half his age who looked perpetually miserable at public functions, and Eleanor felt a quiet gratitude for the sharp tongue that had driven him away, for the self-respect that had refused to accept a life of being tolerated rather than treasured. Aunt Harriet lived to see all 3 children grow past infancy, passing peacefully in her sleep at Thornbury during a summer visit when Margaret was 7, surrounded by the family her faith in Eleanor had helped to create, and Eleanor mourned her deeply, while also recognizing that grief and gratitude could coexist. That missing someone terribly was simply the price of having loved them well. She thought sometimes of that spring assembly in 1814, of the woman she had been in her unfashionable green silk dress, standing alone at the refreshment table and eating small cakes because she had long since stopped pretending she did not hunger for the things the world told her she could not have. That woman had been braver than she knew, Eleanor understood now, had been building the foundation for everything that came after, with every sharp word and every refusal to shrink, and every moment she chose her own dignity over society's approval. And if she could speak to that younger self across the years, she would tell her to hold on, to keep being exactly who she was, because somewhere in a crowded room a man with ink-stained fingers and a wounded heart was watching her, was seeing her, was falling in love with everything she had been taught to hate about herself, and the life waiting for her was worth every moment of loneliness that came before. Eleanor stood at the window of Thornbury's morning room on a golden September afternoon in 1832, watching her 3 children play on the lawn below, while Frederick sat at his desk behind her, working on his 3rd book. And she thought about how strange it was that happiness, once it arrived, could feel both extraordinary and ordinary at the same time, both a miracle she had never expected and a comfortable garment she had worn so long she sometimes forgot it had not always belonged to her. Margaret at 18 had her father's quiet intensity and her mother's sharp tongue, and Eleanor watched her daughter refuse a dance at the previous week's assembly with such graceful finality that the young man in question had actually apologized for asking, and she had felt such pride in this girl who had never once been taught that her worth depended on making herself smaller or quieter or more palatable to those who did not deserve her consideration. William at 16 was all long limbs and earnest questions, already talking of university and philosophy and following in his father's intellectual footsteps. And young Harriet at 14 was the wild one, the one who climbed trees and argued with her tutors and reminded Eleanor so much of herself at that age that she sometimes had to turn away to hide her smile of recognition. Frederick looked up from his manuscript and caught her watching the children, and his face softened into that expression she had seen 1,000 times now, but which still made her breath catch, that look of complete and wondering love that she had once believed no man would ever direct at her, certainly not a man like him, handsome and titled and possessed of every quality that should have sent him toward prettier and more agreeable women. He crossed the room to stand beside her at the window, his hand finding hers with the ease of long practice, and they watched together as Margaret helped young Harriet untangle her kite string while William read beneath the oak tree that had shaded generations of Sinclair children, and Eleanor leaned into her husband's shoulder and felt the weight of all her years of loneliness lift away like morning mist burned off by the sun. She thought of the woman she had been, standing alone at refreshment tables and armoring herself with sharp words against a world that had deemed her unworthy of love. And she wished she could reach back through time and tell that woman to hold on, to keep being exactly herself, because the very qualities that made her unacceptable to society were the qualities that would one day make her irreplaceable to a man who saw her truly. The world had changed little in the years since her marriage, still valuing women for their appearance and their compliance and their willingness to diminish themselves. But within the walls of Thornbury, she had built something different, a family where her daughters would grow up knowing their worth, and her son would learn to see women as full human beings deserving of respect and genuine partnership. And if her story could offer any wisdom to those who felt invisible, who stood at the edges of rooms wondering if they would ever be seen, it was simply this: the right person will not ask you to become less so they can feel like more. And a love worth having is a love that celebrates everything you are rather than everything you are not. And it is never, ever too late to discover that you were worthy of joy all along. So to you who listens now, wherever you may be, perhaps standing at your own refreshment table while the world whispers its judgments, perhaps wondering if you have waited too long or wanted too much or simply been too entirely yourself for a society that prefers its women small and silent and endlessly agreeable, I offer you the story of Eleanor Ashworth, who became Eleanor Sinclair, not because she changed herself into something more acceptable, but because she refused to. Not because she learned to want less, but because she continued to hunger for everything she deserved, and eventually found a man wise enough to recognize that her appetite for life was not a flaw to be corrected, but a fire to be celebrated. The world will tell you that you are too much, too loud, too large, too opinionated, too old, too unwilling to perform the pleasant fictions that make other people comfortable, and the world will be wrong, spectacularly and persistently wrong, because the very qualities that make you difficult to dismiss are the qualities that will one day make you impossible to forget to someone who has the eyes to see you clearly. Do not starve yourself, not your body and not your mind and not your heart. Do not make yourself smaller in the hope that shrinking will finally make you visible, because the people who cannot see you at your full size would not truly see you at any size, and their blindness is not your burden to cure. Eat the small cakes at the refreshment table. Speak the sharp words that rise to your tongue when foolish men offer foolish advice. Wear the deep green silk that flatters you even if it is not fashionable, and trust that somewhere in the crowded room of your life there is someone watching who sees not your supposed flaws but your undeniable light. Eleanor waited 28 years to find Frederick. 28 years of being overlooked and underestimated, and told in 1,000 small ways that she was not enough. And then she lived another 40 years being loved so completely that those first 28 began to feel like the prologue to a story rather than the whole of it, the necessary darkness before an unexpected and glorious dawn. Your dawn is coming too. I promise you this. Whether it arrives in the form of a love that sees you truly, or a life you build for yourself on your own terms, or simply the quiet revolution of deciding that you will no longer apologize for taking up space in a world that has always belonged to you as much as anyone. Be patient with yourself, but do not be small. Be kind to others, but do not be silent. Be open to love, but do not be desperate. And above all, remember that the right person will never ask you to become less so they can feel like more. This has been the story of Eleanor and Frederick, of sharp words and gentle hands, and a love that defied everything society believed it knew about worth and beauty and belonging. Until next time, dear listener, may you find the courage to be entirely yourself.